The both sides, as I said, had complaints about each other. We raised this today. I think the atmosphere was constructive and the discussions were good. I cannot say that we resolved everything, but I can say that there are lots of commitments to the JCPOA and its survival. All remaining participants to the JCPOA are still committed and determined to save this deal, which is a big achievement of diplomacy in the recent years, and we will continue our efforts in that direction.
Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. You just heard the Iranian official, Mr. Abbas Araghchi, speaking after that emergency meeting that was held in Vienna, Austria, with parties to Iran's 2015 nuclear deal. Now, he said that, as you heard, it was a constructive meeting, but there were still some unresolved issues. He also said that Tehran will continue to reduce its nuclear commitments if Europeans fail to salvage the pact. Now, Iran has protested against the UK for seizing its supertanker Grace 1 in the past few weeks from the Strait of Hormuz, and as a reaction even captured UK's oil tanker, the Sterner Impero. Now, tensions in the region have been on the rise since US President Donald Trump pulled out of the landmark deal last year that essentially lifted sanctions on Iran in exchange for a halt to the nuclear weapons development program that Tehran was pursuing. Now, we have with us today Mr. Mostapha Khoshcheshm, who will be joining us from Tehran, and of course, Mr. George Szamuely, from a Middle East expert, joining us from Budapest. But first, let's go to our correspondent, Mr. Olly Barratt, who's been following this meeting, joining us from London. Mr. Olly, you've been following this meeting in Vienna. What can you tell us about how it went, and what was the sentiment like in the room?
Well, I think it was clearly not easy in terms of the atmosphere between the representatives attending, given the crisis between Britain and Iran, but also other heightened tensions in the region as well. All of that said, Iran has described the meeting as constructive. The Deputy Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, saying that discussions were good. He says that it wasn't a case of everything being resolved, but he says there are lots of commitments to the Iran nuclear deal. We also heard from some of the other officials attending, China insisting that all parties had expressed their commitment to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal of 2015, and Beijing also saying that everyone in attendance expressed strong opposition against the US unilateral imposition of sanctions. So some sense there, I think, of how the meeting went in terms of the parties saying that they are committed to the Iran nuclear deal despite recent issues, and they're also in opposition, united in opposition against the recent United States position.
Was there also any conversation about Iran's Arak heavy water plant that Iran has recently announced that they're going to start working on that again?
Certainly that would have been on the agenda, and the UK in particular has warned previously that there would be consequences for Iran if there were to be any further movement in that direction. And we have had these signatories to the Iran nuclear deal saying to Tehran that it would be best advised to keep to its commitments under the nuclear deal rather than head towards further potential breaches of it. Clearly this meeting in Vienna was designed by the attendees to try and make sure Iran is aware that they still see a future for the deal. They still want it to be kept to by the parties that are still signed up to it, including Tehran. And there certainly would have been some pointed conversations, I think, some frank conversations around the table about that issue.
So is there any kind of indication that there will be a follow-up meeting soon after? Was there any mention of this conversation maybe reaching across the Atlantic, next time taking also the US on board?
Well, certainly all sides at the meeting in Vienna have agreed to keep diplomatic channels open, to keep conversations going, to, as I say, try and reiterate on an ongoing basis their commitment to the deal. And part of that from countries like the UK and its European allies is about urging Iran not to step further away from the deal itself. In terms of the Americans, that is another matter entirely. Now, it may well be that the strategy in Washington from the Trump administration is to take a very hard line and pull out of the deal and try and restart some kind of negotiations about a different shaped deal. There is some concern in Washington in some quarters that the Iran nuclear deal of 2015 was too narrow, that it should have been much wider, dealt with a much wider range of issues when it comes to Iran's behaviour in the Middle East, for example. But in terms of future meetings that might include the United States, no mention of that, no sense of that at this stage. We're also looking very closely at the position of the United Kingdom now that we have a new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, coming into Downing Street. The UK at the moment insists it is still committed to the Iran nuclear deal, but Boris Johnson will be watched very closely indeed to see whether he does start to align himself more closely with Washington on this issue.
Thank you so much, Mr. Olly. Mr. Mostapha, if we can come to you, this meeting, and you heard the Iranian diplomat there speaking about how it was, in a way, a constructive meeting. But at the same time, there were some commitments, there were some issues that went unresolved. But what he did say that we heard right now is that all the members are committed to the JCPOA. What is your take on how this meeting went? Do you see any hope on the horizon?
Hello, and thanks for having me. Well, to be honest with you, no. Because as far as I remember, the European members of the JCPOA, as well as China and Russia, they have always been stressing their commitment to the deal. Of course, they know that collapse of the nuclear deal would have much repercussions for the European security, and it will incur some costs on these nations. But still, they know that if they want to comply with their undertakings under the JCPOA, especially the 11 areas that they promised Tehran to cooperate in these areas, they would have to stand up to the U.S. and their ties with the U.S. would deteriorate. Therefore, they are trying to just give promises to Tehran. Since the U.S. abrogated the deal, they have been stressing their political stance in support of the deal. But when it comes to action, real, tangible action in providing Tehran with the economic merits of the deal that they promised to Tehran, they do nothing, zilch. In all of these JCPOA Commission meetings, they have always been stressing their undertakings and commitment to the JCPOA. But as a result, we have seen none, zilch, so far. Even with regard to Instex, that's not even 1% of what they have promised to Tehran. They have not done anything. They just speak about its operation in the near future. But still, even if it comes into operation, it's not going to satisfy Tehran. So basically, I believe that if they do not go for a major step to provide Tehran with the promised economic merits of the deal, Tehran would go for the third step of its scaling back its undertakings under the deal.
Okay. All right. So, but Mr. George, what's your take on it? Do you possibly view this as a possible staging ground, almost a sort of precursor to a negotiation or some kind of talks between the U.S. and Iran?
No, I frankly don't see any much prospect of that, and I generally agree with my colleague. The other members of the JCPOA have been saying all along that they intend to adhere to the agreement. They're strongly critical of the United States for withdrawing from the agreement, but this hasn't been followed by any action. And they've had plenty of time to get the Instex mechanism up and running, because they've known for a long time, ever since really Donald Trump came to power, that the United States would withdraw from the agreement and would then impose sanctions. So there should have been planning for this for a long time. And yet nothing at all has happened with Instex. And even what we have at the moment only deals with goods that are not sanctioned anyway, basically food and medicine. So I don't see any prospect of any negotiations with the United States. More troubling is that I don't see anything even on this little thing, and I think a little relative to JCPOA, of this the tankers. There doesn't seem to be any movement on exchange of tankers between the UK and Iran, which would be at least the minimum for some kind of improvement of relations between the other members of the JCPOA and Iran. The United States, that I think is pretty much a hopeless case, at least until after the U.S. presidential election.
So you mentioned the tankers. What also came on the conversation, across the conversation with all of these co-signatories in Iran, was that UK proposed the same naval policing of the Strait of Hormuz, where this was something that was already rejected by Iran before. Does this indicate that this emergency meeting in Vienna wasn't really geared towards a solution in the first place?
Well, they certainly didn't get very far. If the UK and the US go down this path of militarizing the Strait of Hormuz and sending in some battleships in order to accompany the oil tanker, that is going to end in disaster. Iran has all sorts of means at its disposal for asymmetric warfare, and the UK and the US would pay a very heavy price if they went down this road, and particularly a heavy price will be paid by the other members. So that would be a very foolish and reckless decision for the UK and the US to go down, which is sending in a naval flotilla to accompany the tankers.
And it's not just the naval force here. Let me just, sorry, I'm interrupting. I just also want to add here that not only is it the naval force that is adding numbers, the UK sending more ships there to police, but it's also the US who has announced over the weekend they'll be sending more troops, or they will be sort of upping the security. So this is not really helping the situation, is it?
Not at all. It's aggravating the situation without the US having the ability to do anything very much about it, because the United States doesn't have the means at its disposal to go to war with Iran. I mean, it just cannot happen. I mean, Iran is just much too big and much too strong. The United States can't invade Iran. The only means the U.S. has at its disposal is bombing Iran, sending in missiles. Well, if that happens, Iran will retaliate. It won't retaliate against the United States. It will retaliate elsewhere. And it would be an absolutely foolish, reckless decision, because all that will happen, there'll be an absolute chaos in the Persian Gulf. Right. Oil prices will spike, right, and the world economy will be in turmoil.
And it's not just the world economy. Mr. Mostapha, Oman's minister in charge of affairs, Yusuf bin Alawi, he's again come out and said, showed concern. He said, and I quote, any error or miscalculated move could hamper navigation in international waters and harm everyone. So when they build up security, the US sends more troops, and there, on the other hand, the UK sends more ships to police, as they say, escort their tankers and others who are using the Strait of Hormuz. It's really a perfect situation, as to speak, for things to go awry.
Yes, that's true. As a matter of fact, this has started with the U.S. abrogation of the nuclear deal. The United States has long been working on an engagement for the sake of containment policy or approach towards Iran that relies much on sanctions and military threat, and they started both intensifying sanctions and imposing more and more military threat to Tehran in order to push Tehran back and force Tehran to the negotiating table in order to contain its other power components in missile industry, its regional power, and so on and so forth. But they failed. But as they increased the number of their military troops in the region, the risk of an unwanted war is rising. Under this engagement strategy, the U.S. just poses the military threat. That doesn't mean necessarily that there will be an action, and they know it. They are not going to launch war on Iran because of the costs. There will be high costs for the U.S. and its allies in the region. The only desirable result for them was just intimidating Tehran into talks. And now that they have failed, and they know that they have failed, still they insist on the same wrong, failed policy. And this military buildup in the Persian Gulf would increase the chances for an incidental war. Now, I am surprised to see the same kind of policy by the UK, because they could have de-escalated the situation very easily a couple of weeks ago when the Gibraltar court issued an order for extending the detention of the Iranian ship. That was a very wrong move. That was a unique opportunity for releasing the Iranian oil cargo, and therefore Iran, I'm sure, would go for releasing the Stena ship, the British ship that has been seized by Iran. But they failed that, and they've gone for a new strategy, although they have not joined the U.S. Sentinel coalition in the Persian Gulf, and that means some difference between the two sides of the Atlantic. Still, they started their own coalition, and this would definitely escalate the situation, and the UK would not earn anything but increasing.
So the UK, you
prices.
feel like, has lost its opportunity there, where it could have took a stand and been within international law, not violating anything, but it didn't want to risk making the US angry. But then Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, he came out and he said that any kind of force proposed by the UK would be a huge risk. It would make matters worse. How exactly would it make matters worse, them being there, if they're not just posing as sentinels?
Well, as the U.S. goes for escalating the tensions in the region, we could see that another incident like what happened to the U.S. Triton drone, that was a very sophisticated and advanced piece of technology. This could be repeated again. Maybe next week, maybe tomorrow, maybe tonight. We don't know, because they continue provoking the Iranian military forces. Their spy drones are coming close to the Iranian borders, and another accident could be in the offing, and we don't know if it would go, a spiral out of control into a war, full-fledged war or not, because of the wrong policies. You know, the United States knows that as far as posing a credible military threat is concerned, they have no more than a few months before the winter arrives. As far as the expiry dates of the sanctions arrive, they have just a few more months. So in about 3 to 4 months maximum, this strategy should either end in a desirable result for the United States by pushing Tehran to the negotiating table.
So, for Mr. Mostapha, sorry, just to understand a little, you referred that there's almost a timeline of 3-4 months before winters arrive. What does that exactly mean?
If you mean to pose a credible and believable, military threat to Tehran or any other foe, and it should be believed, and when a major part of your military power comes through the sea, when the winter arrives, we know that staging a military operation in the winter is very unlikely. Everyone knows that. This is no secret. It's not just something that the U.S. knows. Iranians and all other militaries throughout the world
it's a strategic problem. It's a strategic problem, and you're proposing that hopefully things will resolve itself, because this seems almost, and here I want to pull you back in this conversation, Mr. George, that it's a game of poker, really. It's until somebody falls. So what kind of international response do you think UK's European-led maritime force proposal is receiving so far?
Well, no one's very enthusiastic about it. And to answer the question that you just posed, I'm saying, how does this escalate the situation? Well, once this flotilla is in the Persian Gulf, they become a target, an obvious military target. Iran has many allies in the region. You got the Houthis in Yemen. You've got the Hezbollah in Lebanon. You've got the in Iraq. There's many allies, all of whom are ready to fight for Iran. Any one of them would be able to launch an attack on UK or US shipping and provide Iran with a plausible deniability. Say, well, we weren't responsible. You don't have any evidence that we were responsible. Moreover, and Iran has said this repeatedly, if we can't export our oil, no one can. Essentially, Iran is presenting the U.S. with this situation, which is, you want to go down this path, and you are going to have the worst possible crisis on your hands. Is that really where you want to go?
Right. Coming back to you, Mr. Mostapha, let's go back a little in history. When there were signatories made part of this JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and when in reference to this kind of an emergency meeting called, in which U.S. isn't a part of, considering, of course, that they were the ones who pulled out first, what was the real point of having co-signatories in the first place if what they say and do doesn't seem to hold any weight on this current situation?
Well, that's exactly the question that Iranians are asking. If Europeans claim to be independent global actors, then they need to comply with their undertakings when they make promises. And then they should have made up for the lost parts of the United States under this deal. But as we see, they are proving to be subordinate to the United States, willingly or unwillingly. Their economies are dependent totally on the U.S. They make a lot of profit of ties, economic ties with the U.S., and they are not willing to sustain the losses. They know that if they stand up to the U.S., they would incur huge losses in area of economy, geopolitics, security, everywhere. But if the JCPOA collapses, they would also sustain major losses, but not as big as what they would lose in the first instance in the standing up to the U.S. Mm-hmm. So they want to keep Iran under the deal in any possible way, and at the same time stop provoking the United States into a major action against the European Union. What is important, Iran knows this strategy of the Europeans and Americans. It's like playing a good cup, bad cup somehow with Iran. Willingly or unwillingly, they are doing the same. And Iran is sending this pulse under this new strategy that is started a couple of months ago, that it's not going to be a one-way road. Either you stop pressuring Tehran, or each pressure that's laid on Tehran will incur costs on the EU and on the US altogether on the West. So this strategy has worked because it has, incited the Europeans into action so far. So they are showing a little concern, at least.
Concern that they've been showing for a while, but the real question is this concern going into a kind of action that will save this deal? Mr. George, do you think the JCPOA is effectively dead?
It's in a lot of trouble. It's hard to see how there's a way of coming back unless the Americans have gone. I mean, they're not going to come back.
There's a very simple way back. If the Americans remove the sanctions, they've got Iran on the table. They can renegotiate the deal. But is that something even possible until Trump is in power?
That's right. That's not going to happen. Even sort of lifting. Going back to the situation from a few months ago and saying that the waivers, restoring the waivers on the countries that were permitted to import Iranian oil. I mean, if the United States just did that minimum, which is to restore the waivers, at least there would be some way of beginning negotiations. But there's no way in the world that Iran is going to reopen negotiations with the United States and permit the U.S. to start introducing all sorts of other issues like Syria, like Lebanon, like ballistic missiles. I mean, Iran's not going to do it for a very simple reason. Why should they trust anything that the Americans agree to when the next man in is just going to walk back on that agreement? So that's not going to happen. So the issue then is what the Europeans are going to do.
Right.
Yeah.
All right.
And the Europeans have shown no willingness to do to the United States what the United States does to Europe. The United States is happy to impose sanctions on Europe, on European companies. Well, let the Europeans do the same to American companies and say, okay.
Well, that's the big question, if that could even be possible. I'm sorry to cut you there. We've run out of time for this part of the show. I mean, we're ending at a note whether the EU could turn back the favor to its ally, the US, on sanctions, especially considering that the economy of the US alone almost equals the entire EU economy. And with that, we're going to take a quick short break, and we'll be back with the latest of what is happening in Afghanistan. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. In the first half, you heard how the emergency meeting in Vienna between the JCPOA co-signatories in Iran, how inconclusive it went, though many termed it as constructive. Now we will be talking about Afghanistan. A lot has happened, not only in just Afghanistan, but across the border in northwest Pakistan. In Afghanistan, let's start from that. The death toll from the deadly attack on President Ghani's running mate Amrullah Saleh's office has climbed to 20. 50 people were also injured in this bomb attack. Now, this included the vice presidential candidate, Mr. Saleh himself. Also important to note is that this happened just a day after Pakistan lost 10 armed military men in two separate cross-border attacks by militants. One of these was claimed by Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. Now, it is understood that these attacks originated from Afghanistan. Now, both these violent incidents have posed the question once again on whether the progress on the peace talks between the Afghan government, the Taliban, the US, and all other regional actors who are interested in peace in the region is making any headway at all. And on the sidelines of the headlines, whether the blame game from all parties is turning this potentially healing process kind of toxic. So let me introduce our guests who will be joined today. From Peshawar, we have Mr. Rahimullah Yusufzai, an analyst, and also we are joined by Mr. Feingold, a political risk analyst, joining us from Taiwan. And of course, Mr. Javid Faisal, former government spokesperson, joining us from Kabul. Thank you so much to all of you for taking out the time to speak to us on this. I want to come straight to you, Mr. Javid Faisal. Talking about this horrible attack that has just taken place, taking the lives of 20 people. I believe there's also one woman who died. Many of these are civilians. This was an ongoing gun battle, went on for 6 hours, but there was no immediate claim of responsibility of who was behind this. Do we have any understanding as of now who was behind this attack?
As far as we know, no parties have taken responsibility for this attack. But usually these attacks came from Taliban and other terrorist groups. Usually in the past, when attacks like these that faced civilian casualties, Taliban usually denied to take responsibility for them because of the public anger, because of the targets they were hitting. This time we are still to wait to find out more and to hear from the intelligence agencies to see what they think and where it comes from.
Okay, all right. Mr. Rahimullah Yusufzai, if I could get your views on this, and not just on who could be behind the attack, but also the conversation that has been going on in the sidelines.
You know, usually the attacks in Kabul are claimed by the Taliban or the ISIS. The ISIS mostly claim responsibility for attacks on Shias and also sometimes on foreigners and the government. The Taliban usually claim attacks targeting the foreigners and the Afghan government. So we have to see as to who will claim responsibility, but we know for sure that there is a pathological hatred between Amrullah Saleh and Taliban. Both hate each other. And, Amrullah Saleh is the former head of the Afghan intelligence, the NDS. And he has been very critical of Taliban and very critical also of Pakistan.
Mr. Yusufzai, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt here. If for our viewers, you could flesh out for us the reasons behind this animosity, this hatred between the Taliban and Mr. Saleh.
I told you that Amrullah Saleh was the head of the Afghan intelligence, which was trying to hit the Taliban. Taliban, were very angry over these kind of allegations, and they have tried to attack the previous heads of the NDS also. Asadullah Khalid was attacked, he barely survived, Amrullah Saleh, and also others. So I think I won't be surprised if Taliban are involved. But I agree that whenever there are civilian casualties, then Taliban keep quiet. They don't claim responsibility for those kinds of attacks.
Right. It's interesting that they would not want to take responsibility. I mean, historically, such attacks are usually attributed and they take responsibility for them. It's either them or the ISIS. Mr. Feingold, coming to you on this conversation very quickly, in terms of how this is affecting these peace talks and this conversation that is taking place, obviously, of pointing fingers at each other of who could be responsible, because there were two attacks here, two violent episodes across the border. And it's also interesting to note that the timing, the election campaign just started. There are, if you could spell out for us, are there any kind of forces, and who are they, who might be against the very possibility of these peace talks working out?
Well, one thing that's become clear through multiple rounds of the negotiations in Qatar between the United States and the Taliban negotiating teams is that attacks that take place simultaneous to negotiations, to when the two sides are meeting face to face, does not derail the talks. So from what we know about the talks earlier on, when attacks in Afghanistan coincided with rounds of negotiations, the U.S. negotiators would bring it up. And there's even reports that say that the two sides would engage in the finger pointing and the shouting, and that kind of interrupted the pace of the talks. But it's clear that both sides made a decision throughout these negotiating rounds that, notwithstanding attacks that occur while they're talking, they're not going to walk away from peace negotiations. So even with the most recent acts of violence over this past weekend against the vice presidential candidate's headquarters, it doesn't appear that this will stop the next round of talks from taking place in Doha, and that the U.S. and the Taliban are just going to continue until they reach an agreement. They've imposed a deadline on themselves to reach an agreement soon. Obviously, the Afghan government has at times voiced its concerns, one could say even complaints about the negotiating process. But the U.S. Special Representative, who's been in Kabul in recent days, has made it clear that the pathway is, from a U.S. perspective, for the U.S. to first reach an agreement with the Taliban. And following that, there could be all-party negotiations involving various stakeholders in Afghanistan together with the Taliban. And again, that's something that the Afghan government has criticized as well. They say it should be a government to Taliban, not an all-hands, all stakeholders talks. But that's not what the United States has said will be the pathway. Right. And yes, this has definitely caused some friction between the United States and the Afghan government. But President Trump has issued very clear instructions. And to be fair to President Trump and the United States government, this is probably a bipartisan expectation in the U.S. So Democrats and Republicans, and broadly speaking, the American public, do want to see a phased, if not speedy, withdrawal of the U.S. military.
Okay. All right. So, Mr. Feingold, let's also talk about how India is feeling across the border here after this trip of the Prime Minister of Pakistan to the U.S., to Washington, D.C. The U.S. State Department just announced recently a decision that they would be approving a $125 million aid package, which would essentially provide technical support to Pakistan's fleet of F-16 fighters. And that at the same time, we saw another statement from the Pentagon that said that $670 million of follow-on support program for the C-17 airlift aircraft was also approved for India. What do you make of this sort of dynamics here from the U.S.?
Well, during the Trump presidency, we know that President Trump has had a good relationship with Prime Minister Modi of India. They've met many times, and they've had very positive meetings. President Trump and his administration has encouraged India to take a strong role in regional security with China in mind. And we now have the Indo-Pacific term, which is often used to describe the U.S. policy approach to the region. And Pakistan obviously has not been something that President Trump has spent a lot of time on in his 2+ years as president. So this meeting with Prime Minister Khan, from many perspectives, but maybe not the Indian perspective, but from a Pakistan or maybe a U.S. perspective, had many positives as far as the bilateral relationship, especially if, again, President Trump hadn't spent much time on Pakistan issues. So it's good that they meet face to face and they could establish a personal rapport. And as part of that, there were some announcements, as you described, with regard to military support. And there was some concern in India. And we'll have to watch how this plays out. Obviously, India does have a lot of friends in the Trump administration. But on the other hand, these talks in Doha are an important part of the U.S. foreign policy for the region. So if it requires cooperation from Pakistan and to some extent India or even China, the U.S. is going to be seeking to get as many countries on board with this. And it's interesting from this conversation because we were talking a lot about disagreements between the governments of Pakistan and Afghanistan about where militants are based and who is being forthright with information about the source of attacks. But the U.S. Primary concern in its talks with the Taliban is going to be to ensure that the Taliban does not allow Afghanistan to be used as a home for international terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda. And the other stakeholders, such as Afghanistan and Pakistan, will need to stop the finger pointing and cooperate to bring
Well, Mr. Feingold, it's going to be very difficult, as I imagine it, from the situation. And we've got a perfect example just played out in front of us as 2 points of view from either side of the border when there are concerns and there's the trust deficit. And it exists not just today, but historically. And the U.S. is the only one who's got a clock on their withdrawal here. And could this possibly be a kind of a preview into a hasty withdrawal and what it would leave behind?
Not necessarily a hasty withdrawal, but yes, you're correct. It's an issue of what gets left behind. And if the primary concern for the U.S. is to ensure that the region is not used as a home for international terrorist groups or groups that launch attacks into the United States or Western Europe, keeping in mind NATO has had a significant role in Afghanistan as well. And this is their motivation for being involved in what they're seeking out of these talks with the Taliban. So if their motivation is not to have a grand agreement with regard to various organizations that commit cross-border attacks between Afghanistan and Pakistan, if that's not part of what the U.S. is seeking to achieve or the NATO stakeholders are seeking to achieve, then that can be left on the ground, and it's going to be something that the governments of Pakistan and Afghanistan and India are going to need to work together rather than continue to point the finger at each other.
All right. So, Mr. Yusufzai, this is an important point here. Moving forward, instead of pointing the fingers at each other, work together. The cost to Pakistan on working on this U.S. initiated war on terror, not just in Afghanistan, but the spillover effect that it's faced itself. Is that also something that is in question here from our brothers across the border?
I think these issues are now in the past. We are trying to move ahead. And that's why there are peace talks between Taliban and the US. There have been 3 intra-Afghan meetings, 2 in Moscow and 1 in Qatar. More will be held. Maybe in future there will be talks between Taliban and the Afghan government. There also is the issue of a permanent ceasefire. These issues are now being discussed. I think nobody is discussing the issue of safe havens or whatever. Even if there are safe havens, that issue is not being raised by any side at this stage because the priority is to have peace process.
So these are the issues in the past. But what about the time left to the presidential elections? It's supposed to take place in September 28. Is there any risk that they will be delayed once again, postponed once again, considering the kind of situation here where even candidates are now under attack?
The elections were twice postponed from April to July and then July to September 28. If they have been postponed twice, they can be postponed again. We don't know yet. Officially, the election campaign started 2 months before the polling day. So the election campaign is now underway. And, on the first day, there was this attack against Amrullah Saleh. So the security situation, I think is not good for ensuring a good turnout. And for ensuring also an election which is seen as free and fair and transparent. I think that the militants, the terrorists, they are waiting. They are waiting because there will be public gatherings, there will be election campaign offices, they could be attacked, and eventually they can also attack the registration offices and the polling station. So I think the priority again is to have a peace process. Elections can be held later as well. If they want to hold them in time, because that is also important for Afghanistan's nascent democracy, then I think the peace process will have to be, delayed. And whether the Americans want this, because Trump is in a hurry, he wants to reach an agreement, as his foreign secretary said, before September 1. before the election. So if they're in a hurry, then they will not like to have any hurdle on the way, and the elections could be a hurdle, I believe.
Right. Okay. And Mr. Feingold, do you think that line, is it realistic to be expecting it to be met? I mean, this is the 9th round of peace talks about to start in Doha. Prime Minister Imran Khan, in his meeting, has been asked and has said he'll give it his all to try and convince Taliban to be flexible, because they have not budged. The Taliban haven't budged on their side of what they've been proposing.
Well, that's the key. The U.S. negotiating positions are fairly clear. What they're seeking is fairly clear. Mm-hmm. But what has to budge, who has to move, is the Taliban, and whether or not they're willing to agree. Yes, we know that President Trump does want to end this as quickly as possible for a number of reasons. Congress in the U.S. is on recess throughout August, so there's less questions being asked on Capitol Hill about these talks. It would be easier to present this as an agreement that's already been reached when Congress returns in September. And then not long after that, we're going into our 2020 U.S. election season. So President Trump certainly wants this not hanging over his administration as an unresolved issue. And frankly, he wants to present it as a foreign policy success story, that he has made a deal with the Taliban where his predecessors, President Obama and President Bush, were unable to achieve that. So the sooner this happens for President Trump, it gives him a positive thing to present to voters going in the election season. Whether or not they could reach the September 1st deadline, sure, it's very, very aggressive and optimistic. But whether it happens then or shortly thereafter, there's certainly a lot of impetus, a lot of effort from the U.S. side to persuade the Taliban to agree to the terms.
All right. Mr. Feingold there joining us from Tehran, and Mr. Yusufzai from Peshawar, thank you so much for giving us your time here. We've come to the end of the show. We were discussing how the peace talks between the Afghan, Taliban, the US and Pakistan's role in it, and how it is moving forward. But we will be seeing you tomorrow with a new episode of Newswire. Till then, goodbye.